Margaret had always known that running a business as a woman wasn't going to be easy, but nothing could have prepared her for the daily battles she faced in her small tailoring shop on Beacon Street. Every morning she would unlock the door to her modest store, straighten the fabric samples in the window, and prepare herself for another day of proving that she belonged in this world. The shop itself was nothing fancy, just a small space with 2 sewing machines, rolls of fabric stacked against the walls, and a counter where customers could discuss their needs. But what made it special was the care Margaret put into every single piece of clothing that came through her door. She treated each garment like it was the most important thing in the world, because to her customers, it often was. Margaret had learned her trade out of necessity. When her husband died in the war, she found herself alone with bills to pay and a future to figure out. She could have taken a job at one of the big factories, working long hours for little pay like so many other women. Instead, she decided to use the skills her mother had taught her as a child. She started small, mending clothes for neighbors, and slowly built up enough business to rent this little shop. The problem was that most people, especially men, didn't take her seriously. They would walk into her shop, look around for a man, and when they realized she was the owner, their whole attitude would change. Some would turn around and leave without saying a word. Others would stay but talk to her like she was a child, who didn't understand what she was doing. This particular Tuesday morning started like any other. Margaret was working on a wedding dress for a young bride when she heard the bell above her door ring. She looked up to see a tall man in an army uniform walking in. He had the straight posture and confident walk of someone who was used to being in charge. His uniform was wrinkled and needed some serious attention, but she could tell it was expensive and well made. The man looked around the shop with a slight frown on his face. His eyes passed over Margaret like she wasn't even there and focused on the back of the shop where her elderly assistant, Mr. Peterson, was organizing some supplies. Mr. Peterson was a sweet old man who helped her with the heavier work and sometimes minded the shop when she had to run errands. But he couldn't sew a button if his life depended on it. The soldier cleared his throat loudly and called out, "Excuse me, sir. I need to speak with the tailor." Margaret set down her needle and thread and walked toward the counter with a polite smile. "Good morning. I'm Margaret, the owner of this shop. How can I help you today?" The man barely glanced at her. "I need to speak with the actual tailor, not the receptionist." Margaret felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice calm. "I am the tailor, sir. This is my shop, and I do all the alterations and custom work here." Now the soldier looked at her properly for the first time, and Margaret could see the doubt written all over his face. He was probably in his late 20s, with dark hair and tired eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. There was something in his expression that reminded her of other veterans she had seen around town, men who had come back from the war carrying invisible wounds that were harder to heal than the physical ones. "Look, lady," he said, his voice getting louder, "I need my dress uniform fixed for a ceremony this weekend. This isn't some housewife's sewing circle project. These are military garments with specific regulations and requirements. I need someone who actually knows what they're doing." Margaret could feel her patience wearing thin. She had heard variations of this speech dozens of times before, but it never got easier to swallow. "Sir, I have been tailoring military uniforms for over 5 years. I understand the regulations, the proper measurements, and the importance of getting every detail right. If you'd like to tell me what needs to be done, I'd be happy to help you." The soldier let out a short laugh that had no humor in it. 5 years. "Lady, I've been wearing these uniforms for 8 years. I've served in 3 different theaters of war. I think I know a little more about military clothing than someone who learned to sew from her grandmother." Margaret took a deep breath. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but this man was really testing her limits. "I'm sure your military experience is extensive, sir, but tailoring and wearing clothes are 2 very different skills. I've worked on uniforms for officers, enlisted men, and veterans. I know the difference between dress blues and service uniforms. I understand rank insignia, ribbon placement, and proper fit standards." The soldier crossed his arms and looked at her with obvious skepticism. "Prove it." "I'm sorry. If you really know so much about military uniforms, prove it. Tell me something that shows you actually understand what you're talking about and aren't just repeating things you heard somewhere." Margaret could feel her anger building, but she forced herself to stay professional. This wasn't the first time a customer had challenged her knowledge, and she had learned that the best response was to simply demonstrate what she knew rather than argue about it. "Your jacket needs to be taken in about 2 inches at the waist," she said, looking at his uniform with a practiced eye. "The sleeves are too long by at least 1.5 inches. Your ribbon rack is positioned correctly, but one of the ribbons is slightly crooked, and based on the way the fabric is pulling across your chest, I'd guess you've gained some weight since this uniform was last fitted, which is completely normal for men adjusting to civilian life after deployment." The soldier's confident expression faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Lucky guesses. Anyone with eyes could see that the uniform doesn't fit right." Margaret nodded toward his chest. "You're wearing a bronze star, 2 purple hearts, and a combat infantry badge. The bronze star should have a small oak leaf cluster that's currently missing, which suggests either it was lost or this isn't your original ribbon. The fabric on your left shoulder shows slight fading where a patch used to be, probably a division insignia that was removed when you transferred units." Now the soldier was staring at her with surprise, and Margaret could see that she had his attention, but instead of backing down or admitting that maybe he had misjudged her, his expression hardened. "So you can spot some obvious details. That doesn't mean you can actually do the work properly. Military uniforms aren't just regular clothes, they represent something important. They have to be perfect because they honor the service and sacrifice of the people who wear them." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about her professional skills anymore. This man was questioning her respect for the military, her understanding of service and sacrifice. He had no idea what he was talking about. "Sir," she said, her voice quieter but somehow more intense, "I understand better than you might think exactly what these uniforms represent." But the soldier was already shaking his head and turning toward the door. "I'll find someone who actually knows what they're doing. This is too important to trust to someone who's just playing dress-up." Margaret watched him walk toward the exit, and something inside her snapped. She had spent years being polite to people who dismissed her, trying to prove herself through patience and professionalism. But this man had crossed a line. He hadn't just questioned her skills, he had questioned her respect for the very thing that had taken the most important person in her life away from her. "Wait just 1 minute," Margaret called out, her voice carrying across the small shop with an authority that made the soldier stop in his tracks. He turned around slowly, one eyebrow raised like he was doing her a favor by listening. "What now?" Margaret walked around the counter, her hands steady despite the anger coursing through her veins. She had reached her breaking point, and for the first time in years, she wasn't going to back down from someone who thought they knew better than her. "You think you know so much about military protocol and uniforms," she said, crossing her arms. "You think that just because you wore one, you understand everything about how they're made, how they should fit, and what goes into making them look perfect." The soldier shrugged. "I know enough. Do you really?" Margaret moved closer, her eyes never leaving his face. "Because I think you're all talk and no knowledge. I think you've been getting by on assumptions and attitude for so long that you've forgotten there's actually skill involved in what I do." Something flickered in the soldier's eyes. Margaret could see that she had hit a nerve, and she pressed on. "I'll make you a deal," she said. "You think you know more about military uniforms than I do. Let's put it to the test. A real test, not just you standing there making assumptions about what I can and can't do." The soldier stepped back toward the counter, his interest clearly piqued despite himself. "What kind of test?" Margaret walked over to a cabinet behind her counter and pulled out a wooden box. It was old and worn, with brass corners that had turned green with age. She set it down on the counter and opened it carefully, revealing dozens of military patches, ribbons, pins, and insignia arranged in neat rows. "This," she said, "is my reference collection. I've been gathering these pieces for years, learning about each one, understanding what they mean and where they belong. Some of them are from the current war, some are older, some are American, some are from our allies." The soldier leaned forward slightly, his curiosity getting the better of his skepticism. Margaret could see him trying to identify some of the pieces in the box. "Here's the challenge," Margaret continued. "I'll pick out 10 items from this collection. You have to tell me what each one is, what it represents, where it goes on the uniform, and what the requirements are for earning it. And I'll do the same test, and we'll see who really knows what they're talking about." The soldier was quiet for a moment, studying Margaret's face like he was trying to figure out if she was serious. "And what happens when I win?" "If you win," Margaret said, "I'll admit that you were right about me. I'll acknowledge that I don't know enough about military uniforms to work on yours. And I'll give you the names of 3 other tailors in the city who might be able to help you. And if you win," Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "If I win, you apologize for your behavior today. You admit that you made assumptions about my abilities based on nothing but your own prejudices, and you let me fix your uniform the way it should be fixed." The soldier was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could practically see the wheels turning in his head. His pride was telling him that there was no way a civilian woman could know more about military matters than he did. But something else, maybe a small voice of doubt, was warning him that he might be getting in over his head. "Fine," he said finally, "but I get to go first." Margaret nodded and reached into the box. She selected a small silver pin with an eagle design and placed it on the counter between them. "Tell me about this one." The soldier picked up the pin and examined it closely. Margaret could see the confidence in his expression as he recognized it immediately. "Combat infantry badge. It's worn above the ribbons on the left chest. You have to be infantry and you have to see actual combat to earn it." "Correct," Margaret said, making a mental note that he had gotten the first one right. She reached into the box again and pulled out a small ribbon with blue and white stripes. "This one." The soldier looked at it for a few seconds before answering. "That's a good conduct medal ribbon. Shows that you stayed out of trouble and followed orders." Margaret nodded again. "Right again." She continued with 8 more items, and the soldier correctly identified 7 of them. He missed a foreign decoration that Margaret had gotten from a French officer and couldn't quite remember the exact requirements for one of the service ribbons. "Not bad," Margaret said when they were finished with his turn. 8 out of 10. You clearly know your way around military decorations. The soldier looked pleased with himself. "Your turn." "But I'm not going to go easy on you just because you're a woman." Margaret almost laughed at that. "I wouldn't expect you to." The soldier reached into the box and pulled out what looked like a simple cloth patch with some numbers on it. He placed it on the counter with a satisfied smile. "Tell me about this." Margaret picked up the patch and turned it over in her hands. "This is a unit patch from the 82nd Airborne Division. The numbers indicate the specific regiment within the division. It goes on the left shoulder of the uniform, and you earn the right to wear it by completing airborne training and being assigned to that unit." The soldier's smile faltered slightly, but he reached for another item. This time it was a small metal pin with a complex design that looked like it might be from another country. "This one's a British commendation," Margaret said without hesitation. "It's awarded for exceptional service during joint operations with British forces. Not many American soldiers have earned one of these." As the test continued, Margaret could see the soldier's confidence slowly draining away. She correctly identified every single item he selected, often providing more detailed information than he had given for his answers. She knew the history behind the decorations, the specific requirements for earning them, and even some of the regulations about how they should be worn and maintained. By the time she had answered all 10 questions perfectly, the soldier was staring at her with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. "How do you know all of this?" he asked quietly. Margaret began putting the items back in the box, arranging them carefully in their proper places. "The same way you learned to be a soldier," she said. "Practice, study, and caring about getting it right. The difference is that you seem to think knowledge only counts if it comes from wearing the uniform. I learned because I needed to understand what I was working with. Every ribbon, every patch, every piece of metal on a uniform represents someone's service, someone's sacrifice. If I'm going to work on these uniforms, I need to understand what they mean." The soldier was quiet for a long time, just standing there looking at the closed box. Margaret could see that something was happening behind his eyes, some kind of internal struggle between his assumptions and the reality of what had just occurred. Finally, he looked up at her. "I owe you an apology." Margaret looked at the soldier standing before her, and for the first time since he had walked into her shop, she saw something different in his eyes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame, but she wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. "An apology is a good start," she said, her voice still carrying the edge of anger from their confrontation. "But words are easy. You made assumptions about me based on nothing but your own prejudices. You questioned my knowledge, my skills, and my respect for the military. Do you really understand what you did wrong here?" The soldier shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his hands. I thought that because I had served, I automatically knew more than you could. I didn't think a civilian, especially a woman, could really understand what military service means." Margaret nodded slowly. "And now I realize I was wrong, but I still don't understand how you know so much. This isn't just book learning. You talk about these things like they matter to you personally." Margaret walked around the counter and stood near the window of her shop. Outside, people were going about their daily business, but she wasn't really seeing them. Her mind was traveling back to memories she tried not to visit too often. "You want to know why this matters to me?" she asked, her voice softer now but still intense. "You want to understand why I take such care with every uniform that comes through that door?" The soldier nodded, and Margaret could see that his curiosity was genuine now. Margaret reached down and slowly lifted the hem of her dark blue skirt, revealing just a few inches of the fabric underneath. There, pinned carefully to the inside of her skirt, was a small medal. The purple ribbon was slightly faded, and the metal had lost some of its shine, but the purple heart was still clearly recognizable. The soldier's eyes widened, and Margaret saw him take a small step back. "This belonged to my husband, Margaret," said her voice barely above a whisper. "He died on a beach in France 2 years ago, fighting for freedom and for the country he loved. He never made it home to see the victory he helped win." She let the fabric fall back into place, but the impact of what she had shown him hung in the air between them like a living thing. "Every uniform that comes into this shop represents someone like him," Margaret continued. "Someone who put on that uniform knowing they might not come home. Someone who left behind family, friends, dreams, and plans. When I work on these clothes, I'm not just sewing fabric, I'm honoring the memory of people who gave everything for something bigger than themselves." The soldier was completely still, his face pale. Margaret could see that her words were hitting him hard, but she wasn't finished yet. "You asked me to prove that I understand what military service means," she said. "Well, I understand it in a way that I wish I didn't have to. I understand the cost of freedom, the price of victory, and the sacrifice that goes into wearing that uniform with honor." Margaret walked closer to the soldier, and when she spoke again, her voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with military rank and everything to do with personal experience. "So when I tell you that your uniform needs to be perfect, it's not because I'm trying to prove how smart I am. It's because every soldier deserves to look their best when they represent the service, and the sacrifice of all the people who came before them, including the ones who didn't make it home." The soldier's hands were shaking slightly, and Margaret could see tears forming in his eyes. Whatever walls he had built around himself were starting to crumble. "Now," Margaret said, her voice firm, but not unkind, "I want you to understand something very clearly. When I ask you to show respect for what I do, I'm not asking you to respect me as a person, though that would be nice. I'm asking you to respect the memory of every soldier who wore a uniform like yours and never got the chance to take it off." She pointed to the purple heart hidden beneath her skirt. "I want you to salute what that medal represents. I want you to acknowledge the sacrifice it stands for. And I want you to understand that when I work on your uniform, I'm doing it in honor of people like my husband who can't speak for themselves anymore." The soldier was crying now, tears running down his cheeks without any attempt to hide them. Margaret could see that something fundamental had shifted inside him, that her words had reached a place in his heart that he had probably been trying to keep locked away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." Margaret felt her own eyes beginning to water, but she held back her tears. This moment was about more than just her personal loss. It was about helping this young man understand something important about respect, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. "The thing is," she said gently, "you did know. Somewhere inside you, you knew that every uniform tells a story. You knew that the people who wear them deserve respect and honor. You just forgot for a while." The soldier wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and stood up straighter. Without being asked, he came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. But Margaret could see that this wasn't the arrogant gesture of someone trying to prove their superiority. This was the genuine tribute of a soldier honoring the memory of fallen comrades. Margaret didn't return the salute. Instead, she placed her hand over the spot where her husband's medal lay hidden and bowed her head slightly in acknowledgement. When the soldier lowered his hand, they stood in silence for a moment. The tension that had filled the shop earlier was gone, replaced by something deeper and more meaningful. "Will you help me with my uniform?" the soldier asked quietly. "I want it to be perfect, not for me, but for everyone who wore one before me." Margaret smiled for the first time since he had walked into her shop. "It would be my honor." Over the next 3 days, something remarkable happened in Margaret's little tailor shop. The soldier, whose name, she learned, was Thomas, returned each morning not just to check on his uniform alterations, but to help around the shop and learn more about the work she did. The first morning after their confrontation, Thomas arrived just as Margaret was opening up. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, clearly unsure of how to begin. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he started, his voice much quieter than it had been during their first meeting, "about understanding the real meaning behind the uniforms. I realized that I've been wearing mine for 8 years, but I never really thought about the responsibility that comes with it." Margaret looked up from the sewing machine where she was working on his jacket. "What do you mean?" Thomas walked closer, his hands clasped behind his back in a way that suggested old military habits. When I put on my uniform, I was always thinking about how it made me feel proud, important, part of something bigger, but I never thought about how it should make me behave toward other people. Margaret set down her work and gave him her full attention. She could see that he had been doing some serious thinking, and she wanted to encourage it. The uniform doesn't just represent your service, Thomas continued. It represents everyone who has ever worn one. When I was rude to you, I wasn't just being disrespectful to you personally. I was dishonoring every soldier who has ever tried to live up to the values that uniform is supposed to represent. Margaret nodded slowly. That's a very mature way to look at it. I want to learn, Thomas said suddenly. I want to understand what you do here, why it matters, and how I can be better, not just as a customer, but as a person. Margaret was surprised by his request, but she was also touched. In all her years of running the shop, no one had ever asked to learn about her work simply because they wanted to understand it better. You sure? She asked. It's not glamorous work. Most of it is very detailed, very careful, and sometimes very tedious. Thomas smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, it looked genuine. I've spent the last 8 years learning that. The most important work usually is. Margaret began to teach him. She showed him how to examine a uniform for problems that weren't obvious at first glance. She explained how different fabrics behaved when they were altered, and why some changes that looked simple could actually be quite complex. Thomas was a surprisingly good student. He listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and never seemed to get frustrated when something took longer than expected. Margaret found herself enjoying the process of sharing her knowledge with someone who genuinely wanted to learn. The key, she explained as she showed him how to properly press a military crease, is understanding that every detail matters. A crooked seam or an uneven hem might seem like a small thing, but when someone is wearing their uniform to represent their country, there are no small things. Thomas nodded, watching intently as she demonstrated the technique. I never realized how much skill this required. I always thought tailoring was just basic sewing. Margaret laughed. Most people do, but there's a big difference between sewing a button and completely reshaping a garment so that it fits perfectly while still maintaining its original design and structure. As the days passed, Thomas began to understand not just the technical aspects of Margaret's work, but the emotional weight she carried with every project. He saw how carefully she handled each uniform, how she would sometimes pause to examine a particular ribbon or patch, and how she always took extra time to make sure everything was absolutely perfect. You do this for all your customers? He asked. One afternoon, as he watched her work on a dress uniform for a young officer. Every single one, Margaret replied. Whether it's a private's everyday uniform or a general's dress blues, they all get the same attention. The rank doesn't matter to me. What matters is that someone trusted me with something important to them. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, I've been talking to some of the other veterans around town, telling them about your shop, about the quality of your work. Margaret looked up, surprised. You have? I figured it was the least I could do after the way I behaved. But also, I realized that a lot of us have been going to tailors who don't really understand military uniforms. We've been settling for good enough when we could be getting perfect. Margaret felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't experienced in a long time. That's very kind of you. It's not kindness, Thomas said firmly. It's what's right. You provide a service that's important, and you do it better than anyone else in the city. People should know about that. By the end of the week, Thomas had sent 3 other veterans to Margaret's shop. Each one mentioned that Thomas had told them about her expertise and recommended her work. Margaret was surprised by how good it felt to have someone advocating for her business, especially someone who had initially been so skeptical. But more than that, she was touched by the change she saw in Thomas himself. The angry, defensive man who had walked into her shop had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding the world around him and treating people with respect. I owe you more than an apology, Thomas said on Friday afternoon as Margaret put the finishing touches on his uniform. You taught me something important about assuming I know things without actually taking the time to learn them. Margaret held up his jacket, examining it one final time before handing it to him. We all make assumptions sometimes. The thing is being willing to change when we realize we're wrong. Thomas took the jacket and held it up to the light, admiring the perfect fit and the careful attention to every detail. This is incredible work. I've never had a uniform that looked this good. It suits you, Margaret said, and she meant it. The uniform looked perfect on him, but more than that, he seemed to wear it differently now. With more respect, more understanding of what it represented. I have a confession to make, Thomas said as he prepared to leave. That ceremony this weekend, it's not just any ceremony. It's a memorial service for the men in my unit who didn't make it home. I wanted to look perfect for them. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I'm honored that you trusted me with something so important. Thomas nodded. I couldn't think of anyone better to help me honor their memory. 6 months later, Margaret stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the simple black dress she had chosen for the evening. It was strange to think that in just a few hours she would be standing in front of a room full of veterans and their families, talking about her work and what it meant to her. When the invitation had first arrived, she had been tempted to decline. Public speaking had never been her strong suit, and the idea of addressing such an important gathering made her nervous. But Thomas had been insistent. You have something important to say, he had told her, and these people need to hear it. The past 6 months had brought more changes to Margaret's life than she could have imagined. Word about her shop had spread throughout the veteran community, and she now found herself busier than she had ever been. She had hired 2 additional seamstresses, both women who had learned their trade out of necessity like she had. The shop, that had once struggled to pay its rent, was now thriving. But the changes went beyond just business success. Margaret had found herself becoming part of a community she had never really known existed. Veterans would stop by not just to have work done, but to chat, to share stories, and sometimes just to sit quietly in the peaceful atmosphere of the shop. She had become a kind of unofficial counselor, listening to stories of war, loss, and the challenges of returning to civilian life. Thomas had been instrumental in creating this community. He had appointed himself as an unofficial ambassador for the shop, bringing in new customers and helping to spread the word about Margaret's work. But more than that, he had become a bridge between the military and civilian worlds, helping people understand each other better. Margaret arrived at the community center where the memorial service was being held. The parking lot was full of cars, and she could see people in military uniforms walking toward the building. Her stomach fluttered with nerves, but she took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was here. Inside, the room was packed with veterans, family members, and community leaders. Margaret spotted Thomas near the front, wearing the uniform she had altered for him all those months ago. He caught her eye and gave her an encouraging smile. The ceremony began with the traditional honors for fallen soldiers. Margaret found herself thinking about her husband and all the other men and women who had made the ultimate sacrifice. When it came time for her to speak, Thomas stood up and walked to the podium. 6 months ago, he began, I walked into a tailor shop thinking I knew everything I needed to know about military uniforms and the people who work on them. I was wrong in ways that I'm still learning to understand. He paused and looked directly at Margaret. The woman I'm about to introduce taught me that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through your actions, your knowledge, and your dedication to something bigger than yourself. Margaret felt her cheeks warm as Thomas continued his introduction, talking about her expertise, her dedication, and the way she had transformed not just his uniform, but his understanding of what service really meant. When Margaret finally stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces before her, she felt a calm settle over her. These were her people now, in a way she had never expected. When I started my tailoring business, she began, I thought I was just trying to make a living. I had no idea that I was about to become part of something much more important. She told them about the day Thomas had walked into her shop, about their confrontation, and about the moment when everything changed. She talked about the Purple Heart she carried with her every day, and what it meant to her to work on uniforms for people who had served their country. Every uniform that comes into my shop tells a story, she said. Some of those stories are about victory, some are about sacrifice, and some are about the simple courage it takes to put on that uniform every day and try to live up to what it represents. Margaret looked around the room and saw people nodding, some wiping away tears. She could see that her words were resonating with them. But here's what I've learned over the past 6 months, she continued. The most important stories aren't the ones about individual heroism or grand gestures. They're the ones about ordinary people choosing to treat each other with respect, to look beyond their assumptions, and to find ways to serve something bigger than themselves. She talked about the community that had formed around her shop, about veterans helping other veterans, and about the way people had learned to see past their differences to find common ground. Thomas taught me that transformation is possible, she said, looking directly at him. He showed me that even when we start from a place of misunderstanding and conflict, we can find our way to mutual respect and friendship. When Margaret finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. People stood up, clapping not just for her words, but for the story she had told and the community she had helped create. As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself surrounded by people who wanted to thank her, to share their own stories, and to talk about what her work meant to them. She was overwhelmed by the response, but also deeply moved. Thomas appeared at her side as the crowd began to thin out. "You did great up there," he said. "I knew you had something important to say." Margaret smiled at him. "I couldn't have said any of it without you. You taught me just as much as I taught you." "I'd been thinking about that day in your shop a lot lately," Thomas said, "about how angry I was, how sure I was that I knew better than you. I'm embarrassed by the way I acted, but I'm also grateful for it. Grateful. If I hadn't been such a stubborn fool, I might never have learned what you had to teach me. I might have gone on making the same assumptions about people for the rest of my life." Margaret nodded. "We both learned something that day. Sometimes, the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places." As they walked out of the community center together, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a struggling business owner, fighting for respect and recognition. Now she was a respected member of a community, someone whose work was valued and whose voice was heard. But more than that, she had learned that the most powerful way to honor the memory of those who had served was not just to take care of their uniforms, but to take care of each other. The real victory wasn't in proving that she was right or in making Thomas admit he was wrong. It was in finding a way to build something positive from their conflict, something that served a purpose bigger than either of them. Margaret looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky and thought about her husband. She liked to think he would be proud of what she had accomplished, not just in business, but in building bridges between people who might otherwise never have understood each other. The story that had begun with anger and assumptions had become something beautiful, a testament to the power of respect, understanding, and the courage to change.